I always tell this story and it always makes me so touched because, again, as community bankers, there's so much that we get to do. And he said to me, do you know what you're doing? And I thought I was being challenged. I thought he was thinking I didn't know how the process worked. And he told me, because of you, my 16-year-old son is going to eat next week. And I get embarrassed because every time I tell the story, I can't not break down. But those are the kinds of human connections that we can have that AI can't.
Michelle Proshaka, Chief Banking and Risk Officer, Nymbus.
Laurel Sykes, Chief Risk Officer and Executive Vice President with American Riviera.
I'm Brianna Valleskey, and this is Good Question, a podcast about AI for fraud fighters and risk leaders from your friends at Inscribe. Today, we're diving into a topic that's both inspiring and impactful: the women who are leading the charge in risk, fraud, and compliance, and how they're transforming the industry. And I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by two powerhouse chief risk officers who embody innovation and leadership in this space. First, we have Laurel Sykes. She's the EVP and Chief Risk Officer at American Riviera Bank. Laurel brings over 30 years of hands-on experience in risk and compliance. She's a certified regulatory compliance manager. She's published in ACAMS and Western Banker and holds a Juris Master's in financial regulations and compliance. Laurel, welcome to Good Question. We are so excited to have you here today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And joining us well is Michelle. She's the Chief Banking and Risk Officer at Nymbus. Michelle has been named to Diligence Modern Governance 100, as well as a risk and compliance visionary. She's also a certified regulatory compliance manager and an NAFCU certified risk manager, and also has a Juris Doctor. Michelle, welcome. We're also really excited to have you on the podcast today.
Super excited to be here. Thank you.
So I would love to start by talking about your journeys into risk. Both of you have incredibly impressive careers in risk and compliance. Laurel, when you and I chatted at Fraud Fight Club, you called yourself an accidental banker. I loved it. And I would love if you could share that story and that path with our audience, as well as how that shaped your perspective as a risk leader today.
Sure. So I think a lot of us actually are accidental bankers. A lot of us start doing this as a first job. And for me, I started in high school as part of an ROP program. I was a teller, and I would get out at noon and go be a teller for the bank that I was working at. And I think that was interesting for me is I kept doing the teller job as I went on to college. And because I stayed with it for a couple of years, the next thing I knew, I was being trained in new accounts and then consumer loans. And I was able to learn a lot of different things working in banking. I think that the reason I ended up in risk was because my branch was being audited, and the auditor at that time was using me a lot as the go-to for questions about what to do and what the processes were. And because I knew both the platform side and the teller side, it was easy for him to just come to me. And I think part of it, I was always that kid that wanted to know why. I was also always that kid that was claiming that things weren't fair. I always wanted justice and laws and regulations. And I think that having that background in banking and learning debits and credits and how to balance a cash drawer and what people did with their money, even what a check looks like, gave me a really good background to start in any kind of job. It's interesting. I was teaching financial literacy last week at a local 6th grade class. And one of the kids raised his hand to ask the question and said, does being a banker give you a better chance at getting approved for a loan? And I thought about that. And I said to him, yeah, I think it does, because part of knowing about banking and knowing how this all works is it helps you prepare for that time when you do need a loan. And I was remembering back to a time when I started in compliance. Again, I was pegged by this auditor. So when the compliance position opened up, he highly recommended me, and I took it. And a couple of years later, I was in charge of a QC program for our mortgage function. And one of the things that I would do, it was this little Excel spreadsheet long before we had AI and all these other things. I think credit scoring was already happening, but I used an Excel worksheet to calculate debt and income ratios and housing ratios. And I used that same worksheet to help myself figure out how much I needed to save for my first home. And I would use that worksheet
Cool.
with other people that were working with me to help them in the same regard. And I think part of why that's been valuable for me is I spent a lot of time figuring out how things worked in banking and why things worked in banking and why the rules were what they were supposed to be. And I think that knowing the why and the how gives you a much better background in risk than you would have otherwise just going straight into the role.
Oh, I love that. That is such a fantastic story. And I feel like no matter how advanced we're going to get with AI, you can't go wrong with a good old fashioned Excel spreadsheet. Lots of my life is run by Excel spreadsheets right now. But what I also love too is like how you mentioned your passion for justice and truth. And that's like a consistent theme that I think shows up in a lot of risk leaders, which also, Michelle, brings me to your story. I love that on your LinkedIn profile, you refer to yourself as a credit union teller and accounting undergrad turned Iowa Hawkeye law grad. That sounds like a super fascinating story. And I would love to hear that from you, as well as how it impacts your perspective on risk.
Yeah. So like Laurel said, mine is maybe less accidental banker, but maybe more accidental risk officer across the gamut. I think like so many risk officers that you find within the industry, a lot of them are either kind of homegrown by starting out as tellers. And that's what I did too. I was a teller at a credit union. It was my job when I turned 18. I was going off to undergrad. And part of why I stayed so long, to be really honest, was I could do my accounting homework in the drive-through at the late hours when it was slow. And so I was multitasking as I was working through it, but just had this really great environment and so appreciated the opportunity to just it was a service job where you felt like you were truly helping.
I love that.
And so when I left to go to law school, I remember before I was leaving, it was one of the head of our collections team at the time. He's like, maybe he'll come back and be our attorney. And what was crazy was that after I graduated law school, I found myself at RSM as an accounting firm for 3 years. And that's how I fell into regulatory compliance, was to said, hey, you have this legal background. And by the way, you worked at a credit union in the past. Can we marry those two things together? And do you think you want to do that? And kind of like Laurel, it was the part that like put me in the weeds of the job, because you were going into branches, you were going into a number of different banking offices all across the Midwest in my case, and working with those FIs to understand like how did they do their BSA processes? What did deposit operations look like for them? How were they opening accounts? How did they calculate interest? How did they offer the services they did? And I got an opportunity to do fair lending reviews and HMDA reviews. And so to see some of those aspects of like, how do we measure whether we do things in a fair and honest and kind of just way?
Yeah.
And after so I ended up having my son, and I was like, okay, I want to travel a little less than I do today. Just so happened that the credit union that I was at had an opening for a compliance manager. I went and applied and ended up coming in as their VP of compliance, and then later kind of built into the risk side of the world. And it was just the biggest boomerang that I think I probably never imagined happening, but it was a really cool opportunity to go back. I tell people there was a QA guy who had been a lender in the branch I was in before I had left. And at one point, he ended up reporting to me in QA. And I remember him being told, he kind of looked at me, and we got along really, really great. But he turned to me and he's like, the tables have turned, haven't they? It's like, it's a little different. That really was my intro. It was what was so fun then before joining Nymbus was that now I had some experience in both kind of seeing the way of auditing that side of the world as an outside perspective, doing it myself on the credit union side and leading those exams in our internal program, and then having the opportunity to join Nymbus as a fintech, which was, I think, in the world of banking, sometimes we think of fintechs and don't always think of compliance up front. And so that's been a really cool opportunity to do something a little bit different and build a program here too.
So interesting that both of you called out how it really was that on the ground experience and that exposure to the investigative nature and the data-driven nature and observation of risk and compliance. It's such a fascinating world. I feel like it has like this mix of being a detective and a little bit of a scientist and a little bit of a journalist or a truth seeker.
You have to really have that passion for like, you
you
got to be wordy, you got to want to do the research. And I think, Laurel, you mentioned this, but like wanting to know the why. Why did that happen? What did this happen for? How would we do it different? There's got to be this piece to you that just really wants to get to the nitty-gritty details of things and then maybe see if you could do it differently.
I also think that if you understand why a rule or a regulation exists, why was it created in the first place, you have a better feel for how to solve for the issue. If you're
Yes.
just trying to implement a checklist or a stopgap for something that you've identified, you're not addressing the root of the issue. So I think it's really important to
Mm,
understand what you're trying to achieve before you propose anything that might mitigate that risk.
absolutely. And that's a perfect transition to looking at the year ahead and what you are trying to achieve. Laurel, you mentioned that you're thinking about check fraud a lot and fraud tactics like mail theft and counterfeit checks. Are there any other risk initiatives that you're focused on for the year? And are you leveraging any technology like AI or Excel spreadsheets to help address them?
And I think right now, the biggest thing that keeps me up at night is that risk officers don't know what kind of AI is even being used in their company.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm
Yes.
joking a little bit, but at the same time, I think it's really important
Wow.
that as we're all looking at new and better ways to do things, that we are considering the other risks that might open us up to.
Yes.
But I think you and I chatted a little bit about some
Mhm.
of the LLM solutions that we've put in place. One of them that I can name Careful is a platform that we instituted for elder financial abuse prevention. But it
That's
also
great.
works for any one of us. So it's in the back, it's monitoring your financial transactions and sending out alerts. You can put trusted contacts on there to get information on these alerts. But their latest offering that they've rolled out is the ability for clients to take emails that they've received
Mm.
and have them ingested by Careful, and it will use LLM to see if there's any matching patterns to known fraudulent
Wow.
email trends and whatnot. And it'll give them, this is likely a scam, and it'll give them tips and that kind of thing. I think it's dangerous though, because as we're using AI and LLM and these other technology solutions, so are the bad guys.
Yeah.
And I think one of my biggest fears is this use case of A/B testing, right? So
Mm.
you use AI to identify when people are actually going to open emails and click on links, and if the fraudsters are using that same sort of technology to make
Yeah.
their email campaigns even harder to detect and less like the ones we've seen in the past, the grammar's fixed. I think that it's a dangerous thing. And I think that on top of technology, we're going to have to be investing in things like behavioral biometrics to
Yes.
look at how people are
Right.
logging in. But the biggest fraud trends that we're seeing now are ones where clients are actually the ones doing the fraud because they don't realize they're being tricked into doing so. So I think
Yes.
that there's no substitute for education and awareness. And there's a lot that comes out every day that we see that could potentially harm our clients. And it's hard to be on top of writing that much content. So another place that we're using AI is things like Copilot to
Mm.
help
Mhm.
us with blogs or articles or things that we want to push out to our clients. It's not super great yet.
Nice.
I've played around a little bit with having it try to write blogs, and it doesn't get it all right. It doesn't always connect to the right sources of
Mm.
information, but it's been really great in me being able to do a brain dump and to
Nice.
have a solution make it more palatable so that you can run it through marketing and compliance and all the channels and have it written faster, approved quicker, and really getting more information out to our clients about what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's amazing that you're not only thinking about LLMs just in terms of detecting risks, but also for educating your customers. To
Mhm.
your point, there was the whole, I'm not on TikTok, so bear with me, but it was the Chase ATM
Yes,
glitch
the
that people were
Yes.
glitch,
talking about,
the
and people
glitch that
did.
wasn't a glitch.
Yes, it's crime, unfortunately. But
Well
to your
said.
point, I love the idea of using LLMs and large language models and AI to generate educational content faster than before. And yeah, it's not perfect yet. It's more like a first draft when you get
Yeah.
it back, but just being able to share as much information and knowledge as fraudsters continue to evolve their tactics so that consumers are aware at the same time, I think is such an incredible use case for AI. So I love that your team is thinking about it that way.
Yeah.
Michelle, I would love to hear your perspective on this. At Nymbus, you're actively involved in core banking conversions and
Mhm.
helping your customers launch new products, modernize from legacy systems.
Mhm.
How are you helping them modernize their fraud and risk without losing trust or creating operational chaos?
Yeah. So On our side, one of the things that Laurel brought up was, and that I so appreciate about her approach, was leaning into AI and AI
Yeah.
literacy and how we look at new products, new technologies, and the adoption of them. I think that there's a theme amongst the perception of a risk officer that risk officers typically are a little behind the times, maybe don't lean into tools because they feel risky. And the reality is that risk officers now tend to be much more proactive, or we're starting to get there, where we see the opportunity to say, how do we use modern technology to potentially offer an opportunity to advance ourselves, learn something new,
Nice.
test and tune, try
Yep.
out different things? And so one of the unique features of Nymbus is we are a modern banking core provider, but we also offer outsourced managed services solutions. We work with banks and credit unions to go to market to offer unique niche brands pursuing a segmented group. So for instance, we have a brand called Roger that's geared towards military members with Citizens Bank of Edmond. We've got another one called Alumnify and Collegiate with MSU Federal Credit Union. And what we gear those kind of niches and brands towards is we offer outsourced contact center services. We offer deposit operations, fraud, compliance, risk services. And so where that really puts us in a unique place is that kind of what Laurel sees for fraud purposes, we see too. So check fraud is a big area for us. We see, specifically because we run and operate digital banks, a lot of A2A activity. So that transfer activity with that differentiation between fraud and scams, we tend to find that customers sometimes unknowingly participate in their own loss because of directions they've received or they think are real. And financial education becomes such a big piece of that, but it's also a big piece for our clients. And so when we run those launch brands, we've increasingly seen that as an opportunity to do a test and tune, to identify how we can deploy new technologies for our customers, because maybe they don't use the tools that we use. And so one of the partners that we have is DataVisor, and they are our real-time fraud interdiction platform that we use for fraud prevention. And we do use it to collect both biometric device data about how they log in. It can detect bot activities. So it can look at things like, hey, when you're filling out an application, are you moving your mouse in the way that a human would or the way that a bot would? Are you copying and pasting information? What's the speed at which you typed or responded to things? And so you can pick up a lot of information just from the start of an experience, but then in the ongoing basis to say, okay, what do I know about this consumer? And then what do I know about the activity they're attempting to do now? And so we see that as a way to both, one, still maintain standards to prevent and detect fraud up front and prevent it from ever becoming the suspicious activity that BSA officers have to go report, because if you can stop it up front, you can prevent it. But we also see it as an opportunity to really change the experience of self-service. So we look at, over time, deploying for our customers where things like, hey, I need to change an address or my phone number doesn't have to be such a stopgap for I've got to pause, submit a DocuSign, do my approvals. You can use technology and fraud technology specifically to do step-up transactions, to risk rate those transactions, and to make inline decisions about whether or not you allow them. One that I'm sure Laurel has thoughts on, and I'd love to hear them, is the other thing that we tend to embed is still maintaining that human in the loop. So even when we modernize with new technology, I would tell you, product teams across the board will always say, like, how much can we automate 100% of what we do? And our side of the world is, yes, we want to get there. And our goal is always to eventually continue to, reduce friction where we can to better an experience. But there is the value too, when you adopt those new technologies, of having human in loop, so that there are still cases and there are still experiences that you need to learn from. And you might eventually pick up patterns where you can automate more. But our teams absolutely play into that as well, as like, there's still value, regardless of how much you can do with AI, to having that fact checking, to having that gut reaction, to having the intuition that a real life person brings to that experience too.
I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love that too. Any other thoughts you wanted to share on that, Laurel?
I think that automation is fantastic, whether it's technology, AI, whatever the situation is, but you really cannot replace a human being for a lot of the things. I mean, you can have a bot with human connection, but it only knows what we've programmed it to know. It doesn't know our soul, right? But it's a great way to automate so that you don't have your people working on things that only they can do or only they can affect. I think that it allows us to be faster and better and deploy things with less human capital, or maybe the same staff that we've had in the past, but now we can do more because we have technology. So I think it also is going to help us upskill a lot of employees. I think about like BSA, for example.
Yep.
We have people that are super fantastic at looking at trends and identifying potential money laundering, but maybe they're not the best at grammar. Let's have AI help us craft a SAR narrative that's going to be one that law enforcement will pick up. Those are the kinds of case studies that I think people shouldn't be afraid of, because it just helps us be better at what we're good at, what each one of us individually can contribute.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with what both of you are saying here too, just in terms of, yes, there are tedious, rote, repetitive tasks that we can automate, but nothing is ever going to match the intuition, the intellect of your specialists and your teammates and your leaders within the team. And the ideal is just that this technologies, these tools can help them get less in the weeds and more into the important areas where humans really are specialized. And one thing I'd love to dig in on a little bit more too, Michelle, you mentioned just this idea of taking the risk officer role and trying to maybe not go 100% from reactive to proactive, but think of it more from a proactive lens. I would just love to hear both of your thoughts on how you're thinking about that as risk officers, but any other advice you have for other leaders in risk roles.
One of the big things that I look at, and this is whether you're in bank, fintech, any industry, one of the things that I always encourage people to, especially if you're stepping into a new role, is I went back and did a vision, mission, value statement. Your company has what your risk team needs one too, because
I love that.
Again, there's sometimes that perception, and I think we've all seen it. I doubt any of us in risk and compliance roles hasn't, that your risk officer is the person is where you go for no, or the place where good ideas go to die. I have heard the gamut of like the worst things that like risk officers are just,
or Chicken Little.
Yes, I mean the sky is falling constantly. Things are never good. Like it's just those are the things that you hear. And so one of the things that I did in joining Nymbus, and part of why I was so excited to join with our CEO at the time we talked before I joined, was we had this conversation about what risk and compliance could be. And particularly in the fintech world, like how could it be a differentiator? Because we're not really, again, fintech itself, I think is getting better. But everyone who's read every one of the 5 million third-party risk management between fintechs and bank, like documents that the OCC and CFPB put out, know that they're like, fintechs aren't always great at this. And we really want to say, if we leaned in and we made the investment, how different could we make this? And so for us, that plays in regardless, but it was like we wanted to be the place where the teams came to us when they had questions, whether that was our service support team, but our product teams, our project teams. Like there is that concept of a compliance by design culture, which once you build the trust and partnership is like, hey, you have to build it first. You got to get people who are like, I want to reach out to the compliance team. I want to have them join my meeting, because I will say, particularly in a remote culture, if you're not there, that's harder to do. But once you build it, then sometimes you're fending them off on what you can make, but you build better products, you build better solutions, you build better results if you can have your compliance people in at the very beginning to help think about, hey, what are the requirements that are going to matter? How do we risk mitigate? Because part of, I think, how compliance officers and risk officers became this place of no was that they weren't involved at the beginning. They didn't have a seat at the table. They got to the end of a project and then said, oh no, there were some blind spots that we didn't see. And so we talked to our product teams about like, hey, if we're involved at the beginning, we can make sure that the product that we put forward is best foot forward and is most likely to make our clients happy. And so we lean in there. I think the other thing, and I'll turn it over to Laurel, is also just making sure that and you made this comment, which is what sparked the light bulb for me, not just the rules or the regulations, but the risk knowledge. Like, why does it matter? If you just give the hard, yes, we can do this, or no, we can't do this. I tell my team, we very rarely try to come back with a straight no. We try to come back with a yes, and here's what we might need, or here's a couple different options based on what you want to do. If there's something that we think is something we can't do in exactly the way you propose it, there's probably another way to get there. And it's just figuring out what that is.
Michelle, I think that is so important. It's helping them think through things that they may not be considering. And
Mhm.
I'm taken back to a time Brianna, we were chatting at the conference about PPP and the time during COVID when all that was happening. And it's interesting because it was one of those scenarios where there was going to be a ton of need. There was going to be a lot of people that were going to be applying for loans. And here, Chief Risk Officer says, we need technology. We need to use a solution because we'll never get through it manually. And it was a scary attempt because we had never had online loan applications before here at the bank. As the risk person, I was thinking through things other than just, are we going to be able to get through all of these applications? I was thinking through, there's complex rules and customers are not going to understand what they're getting into. And if they don't, and they spend the money on the wrong things, they're going to have loan balances that aren't forgiven at the end. And, obviously fraud. I don't think a lot of people were thinking about fraud at the time because it happened so fast and furious. We ended up, and I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but we ended up doing over 1,000 PPP loans totaling over $117 million in that time frame. And we did it with technology, but I'll tell you that first weekend that we launched, we were most concerned about the risk of our clients not understanding or our clients feeling like they were a number now that we had technology. So we set up a pseudo call center that first weekend.
Oh, cool.
And it was just the executive team for the bank that answered the phone calls.
Wow.
And they had
awesome.
the ability to go apply online and do all of this, but we had the 1-800 number. So I remember taking the very first call at midnight on that first day we launched applications. And part of the reason why we were using phone was also to make sure that, number one, they could call us. Number two, before we funded the loan, we'd walk them through the qualifications. You can only use this on payroll and eligible services. We want to make sure you get forgiven. We want to confirm the information in your application.
Nice.
So our system was telling us whether it was eligible or not. And our system was telling us that their entity wasn't allowed to do these types of things. But we had people on both ends. And I'll never forget that first call I took at midnight. There was a gentleman on the phone. And obviously, we had a lot of people annoyed with us because we didn't launch the second that the window opened because we were testing and working on things on the back end. And it took me about a week longer than our peers to start getting approvals back from the SBA on these loans because we layered in things like getting copies of legal documents to make sure that they were a legal entity. Risk slowed things down, but it ended up becoming this crazy engine that was able to go so fast with the human touch. And we ended up with absolutely no fraud in all of those transactions because of what we did.
Oh,
But-
awesome.
But again, going back to that conversation at midnight, we gotten some flack from clients because they were delayed. And I got the phone call and he sounded really upset. And I was concerned I was going to get yelled at. So I braced myself and I said, these people are struggling. Just be there for them. And I always tell this story and it always makes me so touched because, again, as community bankers, there's so much that we get to do. And he said to me, do you know what you're doing? And I thought I was being challenged. I thought he was thinking I didn't know how the process worked. And he told me, because of you, my 16-year-old son is going to eat next week. And I get embarrassed because every time I tell the story, I can't not break down. But those are the kinds of human connections that we can have that AI can't. And I think that the more that we can automate and do and consider implications and identify risk in advance and be proactive and put things in place so that you're not firefighting on the back end, risk can end up being part of your secret weapon, right? The right risk people can help you have that. Michelle, I think you called it the strategic advantage, the differentiator of you and another bank.
Wow, that is such a beautiful story that you just shared that I think
You're going to have to cut it out because I got
We can't do that now.
It was beautiful. It was beautiful. And I think what it really speaks to is how risk is one of, if not like the most important role in one of the most important industries in the entire world, because you are making these decisions that impact people's businesses and their lives. And to both of your points, it can be challenging to balance the evolving regulatory landscape with the pace of innovation. But when you bring in compliance early on, I think it was compliance by design culture that you said, Michelle, I thought that was exceptional. You can really turn risk into almost like a growth lever for the company, which I think is what you were describing too, Laurel, where yes, it took you a little bit longer to get the system set up to facilitate those PPP loans, but once it was in place, you could handle so much more volume and velocity and create those better experiences and get those funds to the people who are in need. I think that's just like a beautiful example of how important this role is. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about leadership, and specifically as like women in risk and compliance and fraud. Laurel, I'll go back to you here. You spoke to me at Fraud Fight Club about staying authentic and using empathy as a strength in this field, which I think you just demonstrated as well. What other advice would you give to women looking to grow their careers in risk?
Well, don't cry on a podcast.
Or maybe do. I don't know. It could be
I think do cry on the podcast is the answer.
I think, and I'm speaking as a mom as well. I think one of the challenges when you are someone that's prone to identifying potential issues and potential risks, I call myself a professional warrior. All the things that I get to worry about, I get to get paid to worry about things. And as a mom, I worry about a lot more for my kids than I do here at the office. And I think that probably the best advice I could give any other woman in risk would be to learn how to prioritize. You can't fix everything. You shouldn't worry about everything. You're going to have to figure out those things that are not going to make or break the bank, those things that you can just let go. You're going to have to learn to let some of them roll off your back, because you need to focus on the ones that are the biggest potential impact to your institution. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, especially as I watch people try to transition from the compliance role into the risk role, is compliance there's a lot of rules and regulations, and there's a lot of elements, and you're going to violate one or two here or there. If you're not violating at least one law, then you're spending too much money on compliance and the bank's not making any profit, right? There are certain ones that are going to be way harder to recover from. And I think that learning to prioritize which ones you need to put your focus on, understanding that you can iterate, understanding that you're going to get through these first things that are biggest risk. And then once you're done, you can move on to the next area and you can continue to grow and iterate, but you're never done managing risk. You have to keep evolving.
Oh, that's beautiful. Michelle, I'd love to hear your point of view as well. In addition to being in the CRO role, you're also helping drive change across some more traditional banks. What are some lessons that you have or other advice that you would share for women navigating this space?
Yeah, I think two things that I would say. I think the prioritization that Laurel called out was super critical, because that's something that I think every woman struggles. We want to do it all, right? At the end of the day, a lot of us get to the roles we do because we're high achievers, we're maximizers, we want to make things the best they can be. But some of the other things that I've had to acknowledge is the aspect of just you cannot, we tend to over explain and overanalyze and so the importance of, pursuing, how do we avoid that imposter syndrome? Because it's always going to be there to some degree. A couple of the things that have helped me is figuring out how to really get concise and a little bit more direct in how I have discussions, and not in a way that I try to avoid that perception of like the angry woman who wants, XYZ thing. But it's that ability to say at the end of the day, what am I trying to get done and why does it matter? And so instead of trying to over explain myself about, at the end of the day, it's we care and we have all that SME knowledge about maybe the compliance or the rules or the risk, but it's how do I bring it back to really why does this matter and why should you care? And so I try to spend a lot more time in that space when I'm working through decisions and discussions with a team. I think the other thing that has been super important for me has also been that idea of sponsorship, going beyond mentorship and having women who sponsor you if you're pursuing growth and goals. Just someone who, and the difference that I look at is your mentor is going to give you advice about a specific problem, some topics, how they can help you. Your sponsor is the person who says your name in the room when you're not there. And they're the person who says, hey, how do I help grow you? How do I have a personal investment in your ability to grow? And one of the things that I have been really lucky to have in my career has been someone who has been that sponsor for me, who has been willing to say my name, who has also been the person sitting in a meeting with me to say, hey, you're doing really great on this one, or hey, here's some advice about how you could present that different, or here's how I'm perceiving it. Um, and those things for us were just such big things that I think helped. I think Laurel's comment about authenticity and the other thing that I would say in tying to that is authenticity is so important because it brings diverse perspective. And increasingly when we're working in risk and compliance things, we need diverse perspective because we don't know everything. I don't know everything.
Yeah.
So I always look at the teams I hire as like I'm hiring people who are smarter than me to help me understand what I'm not thinking about or what I'm missing. And that's what I try to look for in the teams that I build.
And Michelle, to your point along the sponsorship angle, one last piece of advice is network, show up, go to the events, go to the conferences, get on LinkedIn and connect. I went to the Fraud Fight Club conference and I was girl fanning the whole time because all of these people that I follow on LinkedIn are all there and I got to meet them live and in person and I got to, sit in sessions with them. And I think that you're going to learn so much more if you can branch out and network with people that can give you other ideas, other perspectives, that teach you about what they're seeing in the environment. Going back to the women in risk, emotional intelligence. I think that one of the factors, if I remember right, from when leadership had us all doing this, was the importance of building bonds. And that you can get so much more accomplished if you have a network of people that you can contact, especially in fraud. You might have, another bank that transactions are going to, and you need help to protect your client. And if you have those connections, law enforcement, other bankers, technology providers, you're going to be able to do so much more for your company and for your clients if you're connected.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love the distinguishing between mentoring and sponsoring that you both touched on there. And I know I've been lucky enough to have a number of mentors and sponsors in my career, and I hope to do the same for a lot of the women that I work with as well. So I think that's just so beautiful. I'm very inspired right now. But also, we are going to have a little fun and invite ChatGPT on the podcast to get some of its thoughts on women in leadership. OpenAI released some updates to its image models within the past couple weeks. And so based on what ChatGPT thinks or knows about a chief risk officer, we're going to ask it to see if it can create an image of a chief risk officer. Laurel or Michelle, do you have any guesses about what we might see?
I'm suspecting horn-rimmed glasses.
Oh, okay.
Ooh. I'm expecting a stack of books in the background, regardless of the individual, maybe.
Whoop. Okay. I love this because there are books or binders in the background, like you called.
And glasses.
And
the glasses.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Nailed it. And just in case we weren't sure, there's like a nice little sign in front that says Chief Risk Officer. The person seems very serious though, too. We nailed it. The glasses and the books. Let me just see if ChatGPT has any comments on why it chose certain visual elements to include in that image. It's saying, I wanted to reflect a professional, authoritative, and composed chief risk officer. And then it's sharing actually some common industry portrayals for the role, like demographic and presentation, age range, gender and representation, attire. It says, I chose a woman to reflect the increasing diversity in leadership roles, particularly in finance and risk. This is super interesting. It does talk about the office setting, organized folders that reinforce trust and a detail-oriented mindset, a desk nameplate that just says Chief Risk Officer. I think that's pretty funny. And it even touches on the mood and expression.
Yeah.
Anything from either of you? Any thoughts about some of the things that ChatGPT is calling out?
So I don't know if this is good or bad, but my initial guess on gender representation would have been male. And that was probably because I think typically, and I would say this as someone who attends conferences for risk and compliance professionals, I do think where ChatGPT hits the nail is that you do tend to see more women in risk compliance, legal-based roles, and you tend to see that being represented, I think, more increasingly than maybe I've seen in the past. So it's a really exciting thing to see, because I
Yeah.
think there's always sometimes this stereotype, good, bad, or ugly, that I think sometimes women are seen to be in the marketing roles or some of the others. And all of those are very important roles. And the fact that we are shifting the dynamics so that really it's anyone can be in any one of these is, I think, just a very cool piece to see that that's reflected here and showing up.
I love that.
I agree. I did expect to see a male chief risk
Yeah.
officer, but one of the things that struck me was the posture and the closed hands. It didn't look like somebody that was there to collaborate. It looks like somebody that's there maybe to tell you no. So I think that that there is that stereotype, not just man or woman, but there is that stereotype that risk officers are there to be overly concerned about the rules and tell you what you can and can't do. And I think that what would have been better is something more open, like, of course, or, you know, somebody that was more smiling and collaborative, because I think that that's what you need. That's what you need.
Collaborative was the word that I was just thinking, because when we look at the topic, it uses that word authoritative. And I think what we've discussed during so much of our conversation today is, like, at the end of the day, what sets chief risk officers apart now more than ever is the fact that they are collaborative and they do seek to get input and work together. And that's what they want to do to really be innovative and accomplish things. And I think, Laurel, you're spot on in that what this image gives is that sense of tone from the top. And that is a risk and compliance model. But I think in practice, we find that there's different ways to do that and bring that about than what you might see represented here specifically in posture.
Yeah, I love that, because the way they have this AI generated person sitting at the desk almost seems more like a warden rather than like a leader and collaborator. So that is such a good call out. Well, I don't want to take up too much of either your time today, so we will say goodbye to ChatGPT for now. Very interesting exercise. When I did test this ahead of our recording, it did actually generate an image of a man. So it's also just interesting to see the differences in how the LLM responds, like, each time you ask it a question. But it is time for our lightning round now. So I've got three quick questions for each of you. We'll just go Laurel, Michelle in that order. What's one piece of technology you can't live without in your risk operations? Laurel, start with you.
Oh, technology. I mean, Copilot is helping me author memos to the board like never before.
Oh, I love that. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I love it. Okay, Michelle, go to you.
Ours would probably be MitraTech. It's our reg change platform today.
Nice.
Allows us to identify when there's upcoming changes, whether it's info alerts, rules, advanced rule making, just keeps us in the loop of what's happening in the world of banking.
I love that. What's the biggest fraud or risk trend you're watching in 2025?
Fraud or risk trend? I think AI. I think we hear about it at every conference. I think fraudsters are getting smarter, and they're using AI in a lot of different creative ways to con people out of their money. And I think we're going to have to stay one step ahead of where they are going. And it's very challenging right now.
Nice. Yeah.
Mine would be potential liability shift for scams. I think that's been a topic that's come up a lot. It's gained a little momentum last year. I'll be curious to see if it gains any more in the next couple of years.
And at the state level, I know California has been really pushing.
Awesome. Okay, last question. What's one word to describe the future of risk management?
That's going to be a hard one. I mean, part of me wants to say like mandatory.
Ooh, I love that.
but then that goes against everything that we just talked about. I like what Michelle was saying earlier, differentiator.
Oh, love that.
I'm going to go with adaptable.
Oh, beautiful. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, that wraps up this episode of Good Question. A huge thank you to you both, Laurel and Michelle, for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, your insights for the future of risk. To our listeners, we hope you're walking away inspired by how women leaders are transforming the risk landscape. And we will see you next time. Cheers, everyone. Also, it's totally okay if your dog barks, you can mute it out in the
Sorry.
background. No, it's
Good.
totally okay. I'm like,
She is obsessed with me, so she will not stay quiet apparently. And
No,
I'm like, girl.
totally okay.